Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to those that might be joining us in Europe. My name is Rachel Rizzo. I am a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and I am thrilled to welcome you all to this public event, What's at Stake in the U.S.-German Relationship in 2025. A lot going on there, a lot to unpack. This conversation is going to focus on the upcoming German federal elections and their implications for Germany's foreign policy and economic policy. We'll touch on the outcomes of those elections and what that might mean for things like support for Ukraine, Europe's security architecture, Germany's economic outlook and philosophy, and of course, relations with China. We're also going to look at the particular significance of the election of Donald Trump, the re-election of Donald Trump, and what that might mean for how the US-Germany relationship develops over the coming 4 years. And we have the perfect panel to join us today to have this discussion. Unfortunately, Jorn Fleck, the Senior Director for the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, won't be able to join us today, but we have with us Dr. Stormy Annika Mildner, who is the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute in Germany, and Mr. Jan Teckau, who is the Director for Europe of the Eurasia Group. Both are based in Berlin, so both have an on-the-ground insight of what is going on and some of the questions I just posed that we will get into today. So this is a public event, and so a bunch of people are logged on watching, not just on Zoom, but also on Twitter, on YouTube. And we want to make this a conversational sort of vibe. So if you have questions, we want you to be part of this conversation. So please just submit questions in the chat. If you are logged in on Zoom, you can also try submitting them over Twitter. If you're watching on Twitter, we have folks that are watching that as well. But again, just thanks to everyone for joining us today. We're super excited about this event. And yeah, we will go ahead and get started. So Jan, I want to start with you because I think you have a really interesting insight from the Eurasia Group on how exactly we might see the US-Germany relationship evolving in 2025 under new leadership in Washington, but also soon to be new leadership in Berlin. There's a federal election at the end of February, February 23rd, to be exact. So what are you looking at? What are some of the key issues that are going to shape bilateral relations between our two countries over the coming months and years?
Yeah, thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me. It's quite exciting to be in Berlin. Last week, the campaign started to get into hyperdrive. So all of a sudden, this is no longer boring, but actually quite an exciting campaign. And I think the three factors that I think will determine the US relationship, the US-German relationship over the next 12 months or so, that all three of them are still pretty wide open. The three are trade, defense, and then, of course, the new German government. And on all three, there's quite a lot of uncertainty. On the trade side, we don't know yet exactly what the Trump administration has in mind vis-a-vis Europe. Trump has announced that, tariffs will come. We don't know at what size. We don't know exactly when. We don't know on what products. Is it across the board? Is it only select fields that are being affected? That will make a huge difference in terms of how this relationship will work out, but we just don't know this yet. The second one is defense. Again, Trump will probably make decisions on the US posture in Europe and in Germany, on, of course, the US position in Ukraine, how to support Ukraine. Is there going to be a ceasefire? These questions, all of these complicated questions built around that issue. We have the Munich Security Conference coming up where, most people over here expect, announcements from the US administration. And then there's the NATO summit in the summer. There's going to be lots of diplomatic haggling over this. This is the second factor that really determines how this relationship will work out this year and potentially into the next few years. And then thirdly, what kind of government will Germany get? I think it's still fairly safe to say that Friedrich Merz, will be the next chancellor. I think there's a very high probability. But what kind of coalition agreement, what kind of, compromise on key issues, on fiscal issues, which are absolutely front and center. The competitiveness agenda that we not just have at the EU, but also in Germany itself. How robust will Germany be on defense? Can it, close those fiscal gaps that are emerging on defense? And many of these issues that we will have to wait, to kind of shape out over the next few weeks. Basically 4 weeks after the election on 23 February, that's roughly when coalition schmoozing and then later on coalition negotiations will start to happen. And that's when the real compromises are being brokered. At the moment, everybody is in campaign mode. It's all pretty much, from the ideological, playbook. But that's when the real compromise will be forged. And that's when that third element that I wanted to mention will become a bit clearer. I think that's roughly the framing that I would use at this point.
Okay. So Stormy, just coming to you to build on what Jan said a little bit. Can you give us some insight into really how the election campaign in Germany is shaping up? Obviously, the government dissolved, I think it was the day after Trump was elected, if I remember correctly. So two earthquakes on both sides of the Atlantic, one after the other. And really, like, what are the main issues and concerns and political trends for voters in this election? How different of a coalition should we expect? Although I know it's hard to look into a crystal ball and be able to tell right now what that might look like. But what are you looking at as these elections really shape up on the ground? And what do you think are driving voters to the polls this time?
Well, first of all, Rachel, many thanks for having me. It's really lovely to be here. And as you said earlier on, we want to have that as a real discussion and an exchange. So I would also love to come back to what Jan said about our transatlantic relationship, but I will do that after I answer all those questions which you raised. So I did bring along a few numbers because I think this also helps us to contextualize a little bit where the elections currently stand. So I looked at the polls this morning, the so to say super poll, which combines all the different polls together. And what we currently see is that, and that's not a surprise because that's been the case for the last weeks, that the CDU is clearly still in the lead with 30%, but it's down from its peak of 33% in mid-November. And probably after, and Jan, I don't know if you agree, but I would expect that the numbers are going to go down a little bit even further after the last days and what we saw in the Bundestag unraveling with regard to migration. The AfD, the Alternative for Germany, currently stands at 21%, and it has experienced or realized a steady increase since November. That is very worrisome. And if there is a party which came out, I would say, as a winner of those last days and the Bundestag, I would say it's the AfD and their supporters. So the SPD, which is currently in the traffic light coalition in the lead and is also our current chancellor's party, stands at 16%, has been relatively stable. That's pretty low for this party, which has been one of our major parties. The Greens stands currently at 14% with a slow but steady increase since November. The FDP, our liberals, stand at 4%, and that would mean not getting into the Bundestag at all. And the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, this is one of our new parties around Sarah Wagenknecht, currently stands at 5%, but with a decrease. So some polls are showing that she or her party currently stays at 4%, and that the Linke, the left, is actually now a little ahead of Sarah Wagenknecht. So these are really interesting developments, and kind of also tell you something about the second question you asked about possible coalitions. But it also has something to do with who wants to go with whom, right? So I think it's very clear CDU will be part of it because the others won't make up a majority. And there's one possibility, CDU, SPD, they might get enough votes altogether. However, it will be tight, and with all the conflicts currently going on between Merz and Scholz, I don't know if this is going to be a coalition which is greatly loved among the population. It would be a revisiting, so to say, of the grand coalition. There also might be CDU Green. There would be a first. Might be also semi-unlikely, I would say, because a lot of red lines have been drawn also from the CDU side, and it's not clear if they will have a majority, or it might also be a CDU, SPD, Green coalition, which I think also in the population would be semi-loved, I have to say. And this is, these elections are not just important because of these elections, but also what is going to happen the 4 years then before our next parliamentary elections, which would be really important. And a lot of people are saying, and I would include myself in this as well, if we don't get it right this time in the governing process after the elections, then the AfD is very likely to have an even bigger majority. So just very quickly on what are the biggest topics. Again, I brought along some numbers. So it's always the economy is stupid, as we know, but it's not on #1 place. So highest priority for voters, according to ZDF Politikbarometer, is migration currently with 41% and probably even increasing a little. It's the economy, 32%, energy issues, climate issues, 15%, and prices and wages, 11%. I guess if you would put economy, prices, and wages together, it would be more important than migration. But over the last days, migration has been the dominating topic much more than the economy. And the big majority of people are, or those polled at least, 57% are in favor for a stricter migration law. If you ask a little deeper what that would look like, then there are differences. But nonetheless, it is a really important issue. And I stop here, and then we can go a little bit deeper in the discussion.
That's perfect. Thank you. Well, I mean, I'd be interested to dig through the percentages you just gave us, because they are looking pretty similar to the percentages that were leading up to the US election too. I mean, it's always the economy, right, at the top of people's minds, but increasingly you have immigration that voters aren't just thinking about, but they are actually casting their vote for the candidate who best reflects their position on migration. And again, that was a major driver for votes in the US back in November. And indeed, we've seen, mass deportations after Trump was elected, after he was inaugurated a couple weeks ago. So he's certainly, delivering on the platform that he was running on. And so I'm wondering how this has sort of played into the rise of the AfD, certainly. I remember being in Berlin during the state elections last September for Thuringia and Saxony, and they did well there. But so did the BSW, so did the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance. She's a far left candidate or far left party, but is very strict on immigration and sort of anti-NATO and anti these like green policies that everyone talks about. So, Jan, I might come to you and kind of ask, where do you see these fringe parties that aren't so fringe anymore? Certainly not the AfD at 21%. Where do you see a party like the AfD fitting in a potential parliament? Are they still this cordon sanitaire where people won't partner with them? Do you see that holding, or as more German voters vote for these parties, like, do you see them becoming more accepted and part of the club, as you could say?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think both is probably true. I mean, certainly the AfD has no path to power in this election. There's no chance that, even though they will be, roughly twice the size than in the previous election, from 10 point something to 21. That's a doubling of their size, but there's no path to power. No party will go into a coalition with them. The Brandmauer, the firewall, that is a much discussed issue in Germany, not just since last week, but basically now for years, it is still intact, despite of what some commentators said last week and over the weekend. There will not be a coalition. There will not be a structural cooperation with them. There's not going to be the fine tuning of joint movements and motions in parliament with them. They will still be solidly outside of those operations. So that firewall in that narrower sense is still intact and will remain there. And as Stormy said, the AfD knows that. I mean, basically, they've set their sights on a 29 election. A real strategic goal. Their goal for this next term that starts in a few weeks is to basically make the government look as weak and inept and indecisive as possible, to cash in, then on the argument that they've always been making, that the centrist forces are spent force and that they're not really, out there to deliver decisive solutions to problems anymore. So they know that this year it's not their year, but maybe potentially down the road, 4 years down the road, that could change. And then they move, if not into the strongest slot, then potentially into a kingmaker's position of some sort. I think that's their goal. And then just one quick word on migration. Migration is the reason why the AfD is strong. It's the single most important factor in their rise. That's clear from all of the polls and all of the research that's been done. This is the most important driver. It lost a little bit of appeal towards the end of last year when the economy really started to tank and people started to realize that there were other big problems as well. But now it's back on the agenda. We had a pretty horrible event 2 weeks ago, where an Afghan asylum seeker, a rejected one, killed 2 people in Germany, injured a couple more. And then, an emotional stir-up in the campaign. And then Friedrich Merz decided, basically to the surprise of almost everybody, to really take a massive gamble on this migration issue, put it front and center, try to drive Olaf Scholz and the Rump coalition that's still in place on this issue. A big gamble in that, he really relies on this number that Stormy earlier gave us, 57% of people being in favor of stricter asylum rules. He really, believes that this kind of big majority that's out there, some people say it's even higher than this, the silent majority, will basically, be in tune with what he's been trying to do last week. People that are more towards the left say that this was already breaking of a taboo, that he cooperated with the AfD. So this is now all of a sudden, we really have a very clear front line on this issue, which was a bit muddier beforehand. So, no matter in which way you twist it, whether it's the current election or the long-term rise of the AfD, migration is one of the key driving issues, even though sometimes when you're in the Berlin bubble, that's not what you feel and not what you hear. Because most of the drama that is migration plays out at the grassroots level, at the municipal level, in towns and cities and counties that have to, house these people, feed these people, school these people. That's where the real drama plays out. Berlin is often quite insulated from this kind of debate, but now it's absolutely back front and center.
If I may jump in there, Jan, I think you said it so on point, that this is a great gamble for the CDU, and I'm not so sure if that great gamble is going to lead to a win or an increasing number of supporters. As we can see, there are also now big frictions within the CDU. And Jan, you also said that one of the goals of the AfD is make the centrist parties look weak, and that's exactly what they are now trying to do. They're pushing this narrative after the vote didn't go through on the immigration bill, where Merz, so to say, failed, and they are painting the picture that to the electorate, the CDU cannot deliver. They will be divided. They will not be strong. Then there's also Merkel, who publicly voiced her criticism towards Merz, and they're using this to create a narrative against the CDU. And I think this is feeding into something which we can see on the ground as Jan said, where really the drama is taking place, so to say. I mean, we see a big frustration among a pretty large part of the population who feel left behind. Some of them are left behind. If you go outside of Berlin towards Brandenburg, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Sachsen-Anhalt, and some of the other Länder, it's in part really not a great economic situation. Rachel, as you said earlier, on similarities to the United States. It's not just that people feel left behind, but some people are left behind. If you look at social infrastructure, for example, schools, education, healthcare, and so on. And a lot of people are frustrated with the current coalition and the current government. They believe that they haven't delivered in those 3.5 years, that they didn't tackle the major problems, and that some of the things which they did do, like pushing forward the climate transition, the energy transition, is rather hurting than helping the people. And there is really, it's quite scary how low the level of trust in the government really is, and it's been steadily decreasing. Also another similarity to the United States. And the AfD is feeding into it, and it's feeding from it, so to say. So the steady increase, I would say, comes from these frustrations, and they're using these frustrations, on the other hand, to gain more support.
Rachel, if I could come in very, just wanted to make one quick comment, and this is something I would be curious as to what Stormy thinks about this. When you actually look at the numbers, the poll numbers, and Stormy, you gave us the most recent ones. When you actually look at them, they've been, unbelievably flat, basically not really significantly moving now for almost even longer, perhaps, than a year. You said that the CDU was, 2-3 percentage points down from November, but all of these changes are within the margin of error. And, even though we had a government crumbling and falling down, essentially, we had quite a few things going on in this country, and yet the numbers are just nailed where they were in the end of 23. So, the CDU, CSU at roughly 30, the SPD at roughly 15, 16, and the Greens where they are now, and the AfD already at 20 at the time. So my sense is that people have kind of made up their mind. They believe that Merz will probably be a slightly better chancellor than Olaf Scholz, but they don't particularly like him. They think the SPD is roughly a spent force. The Greens are roughly where they always are, around 14. They can mobilize the core votership, but not really significantly beyond that. I find that an interesting phenomenon that, basically people seem to have made up their mind, and the variation in the polls is very, very low. And that gives me a certain kind of confidence that even this kind of event last week, it will probably move the numbers a little bit, but it doesn't look like it's going to move the needle massively. That's my guess, but maybe I'm completely wrong and I'm misreading the situation.
Well, I might jump in here and sort of build on that a little bit. We've seen tweets from the arguably second most powerful person in the world at this point, Elon Musk, with direct support of the AfD, saying that AfD is the only party that can save Germany. He and AfD co-chairperson Alice Weidel had a conversation that was broadcast, and he's shown, very public support for this party, but it obviously hasn't really resulted in that much movement, maybe in the polls. So just something to add there that maybe is interesting and maybe something to, watch over the coming few weeks.
Yeah, I agree. My sense is that the Elon Musk offensive for the AfD has certainly helped them normalize, which is what you always hear, that they are more mainstreamy, that they're less ostracized, that the big boys in the world are talking to them. But in terms of really mobilizing additional voters in Germany, I think that's not really within Musk's capacity. I think that is probably more driven by events such as the one that I mentioned earlier, that brings migration back to the front. Whatever brings migration back to the front is good for the AfD. This is why that Merz piece is such a big gamble. But Merz is also desperate. Merz wants to regain that topic, and trying to pull it back to the centrist fold, saying we can deal with this. We are not going to leave this to the far right alone. And this is the gamble. And in order to do so, he must really actively sit on top of it and reflect somehow that a lot of people want something different. It could completely backfire. I'm not saying it's a wise strategy, but it is the desperate attempt of a centrist, in this case, a center-right party, to regain maneuvering space on that migration issue, which for so long was basically blocked by the taboo built around it and built around the AfD. That's Merz's gamble. That's the strategic, I think, thought behind it. And whether that's going to play out tactically or strategically, we don't know yet. I think we have to wait until perhaps a bit further down this week when we will see much more solid polling numbers that incorporate these events of last week.
And I think before we come back to the transatlantic relationship, of course, I know, Rachel, you were trying to steer us back into that direction. Just one last thing on the gamble. I think it's not just a gamble with regard to the elections. I think it's also a gamble with regard to what comes after the elections and what Merz is then going to be able to deliver. Because a lot of the things which we see in the 5-point plan, for example, are not so easy legally implementable, so to say. So there's a big question, for example, if border controls can be as easily implemented as is standing in the plan. Yes, he can use, just as Trump is currently doing, national emergency legislation, so to say, for this, but it would be a little bit of a stretch. So it might be, so I think the gamble is also, how much do you promise now, which you then have to retract on later, and if that is going to lead to more frustration in the population, or if it really doesn't matter if you can deliver or not, at least somebody, well, at least then there is a feeling that somebody is doing something and trying something and at least wanting to change something. But I personally think this is also a gamble.
Okay. So this is a really interesting segue into what I want to talk about next, this idea of whether or not you can deliver on the things that you promised during your campaign. This brings me back to just a few days after Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, the famous Zeitenwende speech that Chancellor Scholz made. I think the world sort of maybe turned that into a vision that perhaps it was bigger than Schultz meant it to be, which means that people have expected things from the Zeitenwende that maybe Schultz himself didn't expect or wasn't planning to deliver on. And so I want to take us into this conversation about Ukraine a little bit, because it's certainly on the minds of the Trump administration, but not in the way that it was for Biden. I think Trump looks at this war as a political liability, a regional annoyance that he wants to end quickly. He certainly doesn't see it as, this assault on democracy globally, as Biden saw it. And I think he wants it to end, or at least bring about a peace deal within the first 100 days, as has been touted by his special Ukraine envoy, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. But this is, I think, in the mind of Trump and his team, a lot of Ukraine's future security is going to depend on what the Europeans come to the table with. What is on offer? NATO is clearly, at least in my mind, not a real option right now, and likely won't be for quite some time. So when we're looking at things like a potential negotiation, a potential ceasefire, Ukraine's long-term security, I think Trump and his team are going to expect the Europeans to come to the table with something pretty substantial. And I think they're going to expect Germany to be a major part of this. So I guess my question for both of you, and maybe Stormy, I might start with you on this, is how's Germany thinking about Ukraine at the moment and its broader support for Ukraine's continued fight? But also maybe a broader question that we can also get into is like, how does Germany see its defense policy evolving over the coming years? So I'll start with you and then I'll go to Jan. I think there's plenty there that we can for hours.
Absolutely. And I think Jan is the greater security expert than I am. I'm coming a little bit more from the economic point of view. And you saw that I had to move a little bit. We have a really nice sunny day today in Berlin, one of the very few, but the sun was hitting me a little bit much in the face. So I moved, and I can see that Jan is going to face the same problems in a second with all that sun coming in, but we don't want to complain. So, I mean, this has been an ongoing debate, right? And almost everybody agrees, at least who I talk to, that we have done a lot of mistakes in the past regarding our security and defense spending, and that we need to spend a lot more on our own defense. And also in the light of the signals which are currently coming from the United States and had already come from the first Trump administration and the Obama administration before that, we do really have to get a European security and defense strategy and policy on its way. It's really difficult, but Germany can't do that alone. It can only be done in a European context. And also when it comes to European defense industry, there needs to be a lot more cooperation. At the same time, then the second question is, where does the money come from? And a lot of newspaper articles today were titled exactly this. So there's an extraordinary meeting taking place of heads and states in the European Union dealing exactly with this issue. And I think the sense of urgency really is there. But then it's also a question where the money should come from. Given the situation in which Germany is with the debt break, the high debt, the high investment necessities in infrastructure, the high investment necessity in our social system. I mean, there are lots of investment needs, and we are currently in an election campaign, and defense and security issues in the list I gave you earlier didn't rank particularly high. There is another poll which I could have brought along, which looked more at the super topics, so to say, and peace and security was actually mentioned, but also not among the top 3. So I think it's hard for the current government to deal with the debt break, to deal with the debt, to deal with election issues, and also not having a functioning coalition anymore, while at the same time feeling the urgency that something needs to be done with all the pressures from outside, and also the worsening situation in Ukraine. It's pretty clear that there should be continuous support. And I looked at another poll before our meeting, if the majority of people in Germany are still for supporting Ukraine, and yes, they are. And they are also in majorities still, the majority is still in favor of sending weapons to Ukraine, which also has not been always the case. And if you look at party breakdowns, then you see differences, however. So not very surprisingly, among AfD voters, it's relatively low in comparison. Among SPD and Green voters, it's very high, and it's medium high, I would say, among CDU voters, which also shows that while Merz, I think, is a strong supporter of NATO defense spending, transatlantic relationship, and so on, I think it's not going to be a home run for him to get his electorate behind him on increasing defense spending. Last point, 5% of GDP, as Trump asked now. I think this is an ask which is unfulfillable. So there we are setting up ourselves for a pretty conflictual relationship if that goal of 3% has now moved to a 5% goal.
Jan, I might pass it to you.
Yeah, I mean, this is these are 3 or 4, separate questions, I guess, but they're all interconnected. This is why it's sometimes a bit hairy. Where do you start and how do you get from one to the next? Yes. I think on Ukraine, I think we have to distinguish between 2 things. First is, continuing to support the war effort as we currently do, given a perhaps changed situation in Washington. And then the second question, a bit further down the road, not quite clear yet, is security guarantees and how to, come up with a credible defense posture so that Ukraine can survive if it agrees to some sort of ceasefire a bit further down the road. These are two separate issues. I think the Europeans are quite determined to continue to support Ukraine. Stormy just said, that the German population is quite strongly behind such efforts. The crux is not so much keeping it at the current level. The crux comes should the US decide to really wind down its own support for Ukraine, which is, again, one of those questions, Rachel. First of all, you know more about it than I do, but we don't know yet as to how Trump really go about this kind of thing. The Europeans would not be able to replace what the Americans could take away. Not just in terms of hardware and ammunition, but also in terms of command and control, the data flows, the reconnaissance capabilities, all of these, the satellite linkages, all of the stuff that basically are US resources, government or private sector resources. The Europeans have no way of replacing this. If the Americans fall by the wayside, the Europeans cannot compensate, even though they might up their support a little bit, but those capacities just don't exist. That's the kind of natural limit that we face. So if Trump asks for all kinds of additional services being provided by the Europeans, short-term money is in the market, defense spending has gone up, but that doesn't mean that capacity has all of a sudden exploded, that, industrial capacity has all of a sudden exploded. We're still way behind. This is the price we pay for 20 years of neglecting this policy field. But there's an impossibility in all of this. The Europeans can perhaps do a little more, but they cannot possibly do more to compensate for the lack of US support or significantly reduce US support. And then on this, and this is really what drives, I think, the debate on the security guarantees after a possible ceasefire. If you want the Europeans to do the bulk of the work, that might even be possible if you stretch your imagination a little bit, sending maybe 2 European divisions there, perhaps multinational divisions, integrated stuff, French, Polish, UK, German forces, and a couple of others coming in, Scandinavians. You could, possibly come up with such a concoction, but how to, basically make that sustainable in the field, all of the analysts that I know are quite outspoken, about the fact that such a European force would need a very strong American backstop to back up. That's what the Poles say publicly. That's what the UK says publicly. They say we're not going to go in there without US support. So the US comes into this kind of story one way or another, even if they don't have any foot on the ground initially in such a force. They would have to provide the backdrop and all kinds of other strategic assets if that was supposed to work. So that poses the question, to what extent will Trump still want to engage in such a situation? So ultimately, the ball comes back to the US because the US just has the capabilities that the Europeans don't have. So it's a double game. 2 words perhaps on Zeitenwende and the German defense posture. Zeitenwende really is 2 things. One is the material side, which is, again, money, and then industrial production, beef your armed forces up, also recruitment, which is a big issue. But then you also have a kind of a mindset element to all of this, change your mindset, embrace a new role, especially for the Germans in the military field that they never really were willing to embrace very much, very forward leaning, very, very forward deployed, much more, geared towards creating political outcomes with military means. That's the kind of stuff that the Germans don't dig. They don't love that. And that's, I think, the bigger part of Zeitenwende even, that you have to get that mindset changed. And for that, you need political leadership. Scholz presented the vision, but he never presented the political leadership.
Yeah.
Merz is now promising this political leadership, and we really have to see whether it's going to be forthcoming. We don't know this. He gave a foreign policy speech about 2 weeks ago, in which he outlined, his ideas for what that should be, and he was quite adamant about, Germany doing a lot more. But in comes the final point that I want to make, and that also Merz has alluded to, which is the finances. Germany is in a quite difficult fiscal situation. Part of it is of its own making, because it has these very, very strict fiscal rules, the debt brake that Stormy alluded to, which limits the capacity of borrowing for each government annually outside of an emergency. And we have amazing, investment needs, not just on defense, but on infrastructure, on digitalization, on many other fields. This is, the reason why Merz has already kind of backpedaled on defense spending, where he was more robust a few months ago. And he now said, we probably have to stick to 2% for the time being. I think he's had a glimpse at the books and saw, that money's not going to fall from the sky. So, but if we stay at 2% as Germany, not only does Ukraine have a problem and the Bundeswehr, our own armed forces, but we also have a problem at the NATO level and in the EU, where we've promised to be, a backbone of European security, and with 2%, you're not really, in the upper league anymore. So there's lots of stuff that's interconnected. We believe that debt brake will be reformed. More borrowing will happen in Germany. But you first need to pull it off. It's politically quite costly to do so. So the next government faces fiscal issues that are defense issues, that are Ukraine issues. All of this is connected. And it's going to require a massive amount of political heavy lifting, which is why, most of us hope that regardless of what kind of government we will get, it will at least have a halfway strong mandate to pull these kinds of things off. If we get a government with a weak mandate, weak numbers, shaky coalition, then, who's going to do all of that heavy lifting? I don't have any proper answer to that at this point.
Okay, I think that's a good place to start on the next topic that I wanted to take us to, which is the economic side of things. I mean, we can talk all day about German support for Ukraine and German defense spending, but really getting to the heart of that question, where does the money come from, is really what we should be talking about, and really the heart of I think the issue here. People talk a lot about the German economy, and it's sluggish and it's slow. It's perhaps over reliant on China, at least maybe in the auto industry. There are reforms that need to be made to the German economy. So, Stormy, I might come over to you for the last, as we get into this economic question, for the last 10 or so minutes of the conversation. I mean, as we head into this next election, as we look at the German economy, like, what are really the main economic challenges that Germany is facing? And yeah, maybe I'll stop at that. Like, what is the driving force behind this economic question? And then maybe we can get into how Germany is thinking about it.
Mm. So first of all, I would always like to start with a positive note, because I know we as Germans usually go around and paint ourselves more dismal and worse than we really are. So I would say that there is still a lot of innovation in our economy. There's still tons of small businesses, hidden champions, which are at home on world markets and really produce specialty inputs to production processes and products which can't be replaced because they are so good at it. So there is still, I would say, a lot going on in the economy, which is positive. But now I come to the side which is not so great. We are facing a ton of structural and also cyclical problems. And it's really a squeeze from several sides, I would say, which then leads to the pretty dismal growth numbers, which we have seen over the last almost 4 years now. So last year, our GDP contracted by 0.3%. So sorry, 2023, and 2024 by 0.2%. So it's been a long time in our history that we did have decreasing growth in a row in 2 years. And the projections for this year are also not great, depending on which forecast you're looking at. But it's around 0.2%. I mean, this is really not great in comparison to how other countries came out of the crises. And if you look at the last financial and economic crisis of 2008 to 2010, the COVID pandemic, and then the energy price shock following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, other countries, so to say, recovered a lot faster than us and are now experiencing a lot more dynamic growth rates, including the United States, but also some European countries. And that raises the question, what's our problem? And as I said, some of these are cyclical and some of them are, I would say, structural. And one of the big problems we've been facing for quite a while, but exaggerated by the increasing energy prices worldwide and our high dependence on Russian oil and gas. These are high energy prices, also pushed by government decisions and the necessary climate change policies, but energy prices are very high in comparison to other countries. And some of our industries are pretty energy intensive, like the chemical industry, for example. Then if you look at polls among the business people, companies, it's really a complex bureaucracy which we are facing. And I think this is something which the CDU and parts of also the SPD and also on the European level, this has been acknowledged. And there is a drive towards reducing bureaucracy. Also, our Minister of the Economy, Habeck, also trying to push this, but it's not so easy because there really is a lot of bureaucracy. And I'm not talking about that companies want to get rid of necessary safety, health, and climate standards. It's a question of for example, reporting, how many times you have to report what, and there is a lot of overlap, unnecessary bureaucracy, so to say, which you could get rid of if you really wanted to. At least that's what business is also asking for. We have an aging public infrastructure, and Jan also alluded to it, that there's a huge infrastructure investment need in hard infrastructure, but also soft infrastructure. Unfortunately, we are also lagging behind a lot on digitalization. Don't get me started on the digitalization of public services. We are way behind. Just trying to get your passport renewed in Berlin or to get a new driver's license. It takes forever to get an appointment. We still don't have the digital health folders, so to say, and so on. I mean, there is a huge lack of digitalization also in the public sector. We also are facing big demographic shifts, an aging population. We have a shortage of skilled workers, so that is also a problem. And Rachel, as you also said, we are very dependent on foreign markets. So our trade to GDP ratio is more than 90%. It's a little bit down in comparison to a couple of years ago, but still, this is a lot. More than 60% of our trade is within the European Union, so it's with our neighbors. But the United States, for example, is an important, the most important export partner for us, the second most important partner for importing products. And China is still an extremely important location for production, but also a really important consumer of the products which we produce. There is a high dependence on the Chinese market, and it's not easy to replace this because other markets don't have the same buying capacity as China for the products we produce. So you could say we are hit square in the face by the second China shock. And that is creating a lot of trouble for our economy. So, and last but not least, we also have pretty weak domestic demand in addition to foreign demand, which is also not so super strong for manufacturing goods, and high uncertainty. And this high uncertainty, both with regard to our own country, with regard to the EU, and with regard to our most important trading partners, this impacts investment in equipment, which then also has a negative impact on economic growth. So a squeeze from all sides, so to say.
A good overview. Before I turn it to Jan, just quickly to the audience, we have a few minutes left. If you want to submit any questions, just go to askac.org, type them there, they'll come to me, and we'll try to pack a few at once before we get to the end. Jan, is there anything that you wanted to build off of what Stormy was mentioning in terms of just the economic atmosphere in Germany? Maybe potential easy wins when it comes to economy, not just in Germany, but maybe in relation to the United States as well.
Yeah, everybody's looking for those easy wins, right? Especially in an election campaign. That's, when there's easy win high season. I think it's fantastic how Stormy framed it. It's a slap in the face, of the German model on all fronts at the same time. And sometimes when you look at the election platforms of the various parties and the stuff that they say during rallies and so on, there's a sense that the enormity of that situation hasn't completely sunk in, with those main protagonists. When you look at what the conservatives, the CDU has in mind, that's a classic supply side kind of economic reform program, lowering taxes, deregulation, trimming the welfare state, and fighting bureaucracy, and then somehow this will be enough to turn it into not just massive growth, but into a self kind of paying reform scheme. I think that's probably unrealistic. And on the left, what you see is the exact opposite. You see a classic Keynesian deficit spending program, borrowing a whole lot more, so that you can, stimulate growth and just put liquidity into the market at a grand scale. So what you have here is classic, answers, typical, conservative versus, more left-leaning social democratic responses, almost textbook, but nothing particularly innovative. There's not an idea out there, that can instill hope at the same size that we have a slap in the face. Nothing that's commensurate to the size of the problem. Everybody knows that these, kind of classic textbook recipes will probably not be enough. And that's the worrisome part. I'm always saying jokingly that nobody on the campaign trail, wants to get caught speaking the truth before the elections. And so what they give you is basically their left-wing, right-wing kind of fairy tale stuff that they always dream about. But everybody knows that that's not going to be enough. My hope is, and this is the silver lining, because I don't think that they're easy wins, the low-hanging fruit type stuff, of course you can get rid of a lot of bureaucracy, but we all know how difficult it is to get that done. My hope, the only hope that I have, or maybe, the biggest hope that I have is that as soon as the campaign is over, the election results are in, some sort of government constellation emerges and negotiations start, that there's a profound sense of urgency among the people in the room, that they have, that they basically know not only is this a massive economic crisis, but also the far right is just, waiting on the fringes, and waiting for 29 to come. This is, the next 4 years are really decisive. Let's, move some of that party political kabuki to the side and get down to some of the decisive questions. All of us will have to swallow very hard, and painful stuff will come, but we need to do it. I mean, the sense of urgency is my big hope. From the campaign trail, you wouldn't notice that this is already, what the political class has completely internalized. That's my take. And in that sense, I'm a bit underwhelmed by what I see on the campaign trail. And migration, in that sense, there's no doubt that migration is a massively important issue, but it's quite scary to see how it crowds out all of these other big strategic issues, from Ukraine to defense to the economy, that probably in the end will be more decisive for the future of the country.
And if I may just briefly jump in, it's also one thing which I would also look closely at is how young voters and first-time voters are going to vote. In the last election, federal election, they voted very strongly for the Greens, and climate issue were extremely high on their agenda, and they were really not so worried about the economic situation and their jobs. If you now look at polls, they are very worried about jobs, the economic situation, much more than the average, and also they are worried about security and peace. And so it's going to be really interesting to watch how this voter group is going to turn up at the polls, and then who they are going to give their vote to.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. And we'll be able to have this discussion on, I think it's February 25th, because we are doing another event, public event at the Atlantic Council at 9 a.m. Eastern time that day, to debrief the German elections. That's just 2 days after it happened. So all of these things that we've discussed today, we'll be able to unpack right after the German elections, February 25th, 9 a.m. So put that on your calendars for those watching. To Stormy and Jan, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. I mean, this was really a tour de force of German economic policy, the political situation on the ground, what's going on with defense and security. And I think all of us really benefited from your insights today. So to both of you, I don't think there's anyone better we could have had for this discussion. So on behalf of all of us at the Atlantic Council, thank you. And thank you to those that are tuning in for watching this event, and stay tuned for more.
And thanks for the perfect moderation.